Hello my beautiful watchers, and welcome to Lost in Adaptation, the YouTube-based review show dedicated to discussing how loyally film and TV shows align with the books they're based on. As of the posting of this episode, the fourth and final season of Netflix The Umbrella Academy has just concluded, so it seems like an opportune time to see how loyally it's stuck to the comic books of the same name. That said, I'm not actually planning to include season 4 in this because the TV show overtook the comic book series after season 3 and, well, because I really didn't like it. And cards on the table, I'm probably not going to talk much about season 2 or 3 either, because like 99.9% of the similarities between the books and the show are in season 1, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We got to talk about the comic first. Okay, a lot of you already know this, but you'll have to bear with me for just a minute because I'm really excited to get to be the one to tell the others. The Umbrella Academy, first published in 2007, was written by Gerard Way. Yeah, that Gerard Way.
When I was a young boy, my father took me into the city to see a marching band.
The frontman of My Chemical Romance wrote The Umbrella Academy. Like, for sure, people can do multiple things with their lives, but that just sounds so weird every time I say it out loud. My guy was one of the lead contributors to the emo craze of the mid-2000s, but apparently singing was his fucking side gig because the dude published his first comic book at age 16 and got a degree from the School of Visual Arts in New York. In 2007, Way collaborated with artist Gabriel Ba to make Volume 1 of The Umbrella Academy, Apocalypse Suite, and again in 2008 for the sequel, The Umbrella Academy Dallas, intermixed with a bunch of spin-off short stories set in the Umbrella universe. The intention to make a third installment was announced, but it appears that Way got wrapped up in multiple other writing projects and decided to move away from Umbrella Academy. As a result, Volume 3 wasn't fully available until a full decade later in 2019, presumably after the creation of the TV show reawakened interest in the IP. FYI, one of said other writing projects was the co-creation of a Marvel comic book character called Penny Parker, an alternate universe version of Spider-Man who fights evil using an Evangelion-inspired mech suit. A not very comic book accurate version of this character would eventually be included in the hit animated movie Into the Spider-Verse. Not too long after Volume 1's publication, Universal Studios opted the rights to adapt the story into film, but after years and years of publicly expressed optimism but no actual results, the project was passed on to their TV subsidiary, Universal Content Productions, who produced a 10-episode season to be hosted by Netflix in 2019. Canadian screenwriter Steve Blackman was tapped as the showrunner. Interesting backstory there, the dude started his career as a divorce lawyer before deciding that was too depressing for him, so he ran off and ended up helping make Bones and Fargo. Like the comic books, the show was an ensemble cast of arguably 6 main characters and a bunch of regular side characters attached to each of them. Now that he was done getting burninated on Game of Thrones, English actor Tom Hopper was available to put on his best American accent, and he was joined by David Castaneda, Emmy Raver-Lampman, Robert Sheehan, who was also tragically putting an American accent over his beautiful Irish brogue.
Hello, I'm called Robert most of the time.
And occasionally I'm called Tom.
Aidan Gallagher, Elliot Page, and Justin H. Min and Com Fury, despite their characters being dead before the start of the series. Sorry I can't name everyone, it's a big cast. Public opinion on the Umbrella Academy may be a little in flux at the moment due to its seemingly unnecessarily miserable conclusion, but I'm hoping in the long term it will be remembered for the scenes that were an absolute fucking masterclass in directing and editing. My personal taste in music is somewhat limited due to casual disinterest, but it feels like the Umbrella Academy soundtrack was made just for me. It was made for me. Fucking banger after banger. Just a heads up to avoid confusion, in Season 3, the showrunners made a fairly last-minute rewrite to include Victor Hardgreaves coming out as a trans man, so the character could match the new gender identity of the actor playing him, as Elliot Page had recently done the same thing for real. And before anyone laments sacrificing accuracy to the comic for the sake of real-life events, trust me, they were so far off book at this point it made zero difference, and I'm certain Gerard Way approved of this sign of respect and support, as he's been pretty public about not feeling fully at home in his own assigned gender. Plus, Victor's family managed to be so immediately, earnestly supportive of Victor coming out, it genuinely brought tears to my eyes.
Is that an issue for anyone?
No, I'm good with it.
Yeah, me too. Cool.
Luther wants to throw you a big stupid party so you can feel loved.
Oh,
Do you feel loved?
yeah, I do.
Good. You are.
I really like the hair. It's number 10. Yeah, it's a good choice.
If a dysfunctional, traumatized, and occasionally murderous ragtag group of metahumans can accept their trans relatives so easily, the rest of us really have no excuses. Anyways, the point is, even though I'll mostly be talking about Season 1, in which the character goes by Vanya and uses she/her pronouns, because it's just so inexcusably gauche to deadname someone, I'll be referring to the show version of the character as Victor throughout. The story starts with 43 babies mysteriously born to women who were not pregnant until seconds before the birth, and an eccentric genius billionaire scientist named Sir Reginald Hardgreaves adopting the 7 of them that he could procure. The children each have a unique superpower, and Hardgreaves raises and trains them in his mansion that he dubs the Umbrella Academy to be future superheroes, but like, super abusively, mentally and physically torturing them in the process. He initially only gives them numbers instead of names, but most pick out one for themselves. There's number 1, Luther, who has super strength. Number 2, Diego. He throws knives, but whether or not that's his superpower is somewhat in question. Number 3, Allison, who has the ability to control people's minds for a short time by using the phrase, "I heard a rumor." Number 4, Klaus, who can commune with the dead. The way he goes about it is slightly different, but that's the gist of it. Number 5, who never gets around to choosing a name. Again, exactly what his powers are is a little bit in question, so we'll have to swing back to it, but time travel is definitely involved. Number 6, Ben, who can extend weird things from his chest. And number 7, Victor, who's supposedly the odd one out, having no special powers at all. Hardgreaves is assisted by a chimp named Pongo, who he raised to full sapience using science, and a robot that he programmed to be their foster mother. Over the course of their upbringing, Luther is badly injured, and his father is forced to turn him into a big ape man to save his life in an unprecedented medical procedure. Ben is killed in the line of duty, and number 5 goes missing in mysterious circumstances. Jumping ahead about 20 years, the 5 remaining Hardgreave children are informed that their father has snuffed it, and return to the academy for the funeral, which is quite a trip for Luther as he's been living on the moon for the last few years. Said funeral is unexpectedly gate-crashed by the long-missing number 5, who appears to still be a minor despite, as he explains to them, having lived for the better part of 50 years in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. He had eventually figured out how to time travel back to before the apocalypse occurred, but had been physically, though not mentally, transformed back into a child in the process, and is now attempting to prevent whatever devastated the world he witnessed. He's somewhat hampered by attacks from mysterious, well-armed henchmen, but doesn't break too much of a sweat, brutally murdering all of them. While the superpowered members of the Umbrella Academy dysfunctionally blunder around trying to figure out what's going to end the world in a matter of days, Victor, the supposedly superpower-less member of the family and most socially distant because of the apparently rather harsh autobiography he wrote about the family, is approached by a mysterious admirer who believes he might have untapped potential and indeed unlocks more power in him than the rest of the family combined, turning him into a sound-based superhuman with the potential to destroy the entire planet. One of the first things he does with this new power is kill the guy who helped him unlock it, but he was evil, so whatever. More upsettingly though, he also kills Pogo. Realizing that their own sibling was the threat that they were looking for, the rest of the academy struggled to prevent him from ending the world, but their efforts inadvertently cause a huge chunk of the moon to come crashing down towards Earth. And as mentioned, this is where the show kind of stops being an adaptation of the comics and starts doing its own thing. In Season 2, the only things they borrowed from Volume 2 of the comic was the basic concept of the family ending up back in the 1960s and involved in the JFK assassination, and a talking fish boss. Amusingly, the last-minute Season 2 reveal that Hardgreaves is a reptilian space alien wearing a latex human mask was revealed on page 3 of the first issue of the comic. You were supposed to know this the entire time, it just never really becomes relevant. Regarding Season 3, the only comic-accurate things I can think of are a weird hotel is kind of involved, and they set up what appears to be the Sparrow Academy in the last few pages. However, some elements of Volume 2 were borrowed by Season 1, like the bureaucratic trans-time and dimensional organization in charge of maintaining a correct timeline throughout all of history that Number 5 worked for a while as their best assassin, and Hazel and Cha-Cha, their second most notorious killing team that they send after him when he goes AWOL. BT dubs, Marvel Comics has such a long, complicated, rebooted, reimagined and or retconned history that I was genuinely scared to try to look up who had copied whose homework regarding the super powerful temporal enforcement agencies that for some reason use the aesthetic of a 20th century office environment, but it does appear that Marvel was playing around with the idea as far back as the 80s, so. And finally, it is mildly disturbing to note that Allison is divorced and her husband has full custody of the child in both versions, and in both versions it's confirmed that the marriage was the result of her using her superpowers to brainwash him into believing that he loved her.
I heard a rumor that I get it in one I heard a rumor that you think I'm perfect for this. I heard a rumor that you love me.
And neither really addresses the huge consent issues that come with this, though the absence of it is more felt in the TV show where the characters were changed to be decidedly more moral in general. Speaking of which... Gods help me, it's kind of impossible to know where to start here. If I tried to cover everything, I would just be describing 2/3 of the comics to you, so for the sake of brevity, I'm mostly going to talk about things that have some sort of representation in the show, but ended up having their own unique twist. So, the first notable change between the comic and the show I want to highlight is the setting. Way's comic is way more, well, cartoonish? Weird shit is everywhere. I kid you not, relatively speaking, the Umbrella Academy is probably one of the less unusual things in this world. The opening page sets this tone in no uncertain terms. Before the kids are even born, there's a televised wrestling match between a human and a space squid from Rigel X9. Pogo isn't the only intelligent chimpanzee here. Apparently Professor Bad Dad's scientific discoveries were used to make the entire species as smart as humans, and they're just an unremarkable part of society now. Things have clearly been so surreal for so long, people don't initially even react to an invasion of flying Daleks until they actively start blowing shit up. The TV show's world is comparatively way more grounded. There are supernatural things going on besides the Academy, like the time bureaucracy, but no one knows about them. As far as the human race in general is aware, the Hardgreave family is the only thing that's bonkerballs in their world. This extreme toning down applies to a lot of the story and characters too. One of the Academy's early victories, defeating the Eiffel Tower after it sprang to life under the control of zombie Gustav Eiffel and causing it to blast off into space, becomes a run-of-the-mill bank robbery foiling. And the asshole who draws Victor to the dark side goes from being a supervillain called the Conductor to just a guy who has a lot of issues. To be fair, there's a tongue-in-cheek reference to the Eiffel Tower in the show, but you get the idea. Notable changes were made to pretty much all of the main cast of Academy kids as well, both physically and regarding their abilities. That said, it's a tad difficult to directly compare their powers because, at least as far as I've observed, they're a little inconsistent in the comic, but hopefully you'll see what I mean as I go through them. So, in order of the family's numerical designations, Netflix Luthor was critically injured during a mission that he undertook alone after all of the other children had left the Academy, sustaining fatal chemical burns across his body and forcing his father to inject him with a super serum that would save his life but was intended for chimps. As a result, he became all roided up with gorilla-like hair and muscles, though amusingly the bodysuit they stuffed him in got steadily smaller and less goofy looking with every season. The comic version of him is a human head fully transplanted onto a Martian's body, who happened to look like a gorilla and appears to be partly cyborg as well. Yeah, so Luthor tried to become the first human on Mars, discovered a race of ape men living there, got badly hurt in an undefined accident, and for some reason, the only solution was to stick his head on an alien gorilla's body. Diego's only confirmed comic book superpower is the ability to indefinitely hold his breath, though one has to assume he also has enhanced strength, agility, and resistance considering what he survives. Knife throwing was just a skill that he learned along with martial arts, but I guess the show decided to make that his whole thing, giving him the ability to affect the trajectory of objects in flight, which usually just means small blades, but is upgraded to include incoming bullets in Season 2. Allison's abilities are even more overpowered in the comic. It's not just mind control, she has what can only be described as the power to change reality to match her statements. If she says that something happened or will happen, it just does. If she tells someone that their camera is about to break, it breaks, and if she tells someone their building's air ducts are filled with cockroaches, they suddenly become so. The upper limit to this is one of the inconsistencies I mentioned. In Volume 3, she claims she can't help an injured person magically walk again just by telling her that she can, but in a short story attached to the end of Volume 1, she accidentally manifests another living version of herself simply by lying about where she was going each night, which is damn near omnipotent levels of power. What they did with Klaus is interesting. For one thing, his useful powers were levitation and telekinesis, and he uses being able to nebulously communicate with the dead and summon them to possess his body much less often. In Volume 2, he can also possess other people and send messages to a TV screen like in Poltergeist, but added the proviso that he needs to be barefoot in order for his powers to work. The show cut out everything that wasn't seeing the dead, then worked up to him gaining the ability to temporarily give ghosts physical form, then becoming a vessel for Ben in particular. He was also in a better place in Volume 1 of the comic. He referenced drug use, but the addiction hadn't taken as much of a physical or mental toll on him yet. He didn't hit rock bottom until Volume 3, long after the Vanya and time travel arcs were concluded. The show accelerated this bottom hitting and made him into a very funny but ultimately tragic figure. So worn out by the constant barrage of ghost visions, he'd turned to drug use to drown them out and hides his pain behind his outlandish behavior and constant wisecracking. Number 5 gained a Nightcrawler-esque power to teleport short distances in the show. Originally, his thing was purely time travel based, though once he joined the Commission, they surgically enhanced his body and taught him how to use tiny micro jumps into the future to appear to be moving super fast. His time travel miscalculation dragged him all the way back down to 10 years old originally. The show upped this to 13 so they could cast a 15-year-old, and I'm pretty sure we're all glad they did because Gallagher's performance was a huge draw. Dude was carrying the show in places. FYI, he's got a pretty big following on YouTube and he's a solid singer. Ben is harder to compare because he's dead before the beginning of the story, and unlike in the show, in the comic he doesn't come back as a ghost, he's just not in the story. In one of his brief childhood appearances, it seems like his powers are fairly similar, i.e. tentacles emerging from his torso, though complicating matters somewhat, his memorial statue appears to show a formless lumpy mass coming out of him, so I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. Victor is kind of comic accurate in actions in Season 1, but there's a definite physical divergence from Vanya once the conductor subjected her to a horrible scientific experiment that turned her skin pure white and warped her body to resemble her instrument of choice. Mild reference is made to this in the show as his suit and violin turn white as he goes Super Saiyan at the end, but he goes back to looking normal again afterwards. How the team resolved his attempt to wipe out the planet is a big change and kind of an ironic one. In the show, after multiple failed attempts to subdue him, Allison, who'd formed the closest connection with him throughout the season, manages to get behind him with a gun but can't bring herself to kill him, instead using the shockwave of a bullet to knock him out, which unfortunately causes his power to discharge into the moon and end the world after all, and forcing the family to travel back in time to avoid and hopefully prevent it. In the original comic book sequence of events, 5 has the gun and he straight up shoots his sister in the head without any hesitation. Yeah, it turns out the bureaucrats had done something to his brain to remove his humanity in the comics, so he was capable of literally anything without conscience, something he avenges himself of by eating his former boss in Volume 2, a rather disturbing act that was understandably reassigned to the Handler, a power-hungry member of the Commission and the main villain of that season. Vanya somehow survives the bullet to the brain, but spends the next 2 volumes of the comic series recovering her memory and ability to move her body. A big chunk of the moon does come crashing down on top of them, but Klaus uses his telekinetic powers to catch it before it hits. In general, the ending of the first installment of the comic wrapped things up in a way that left the potential for it to be a standalone story, presumably in case it wasn't successful enough to warrant any sequels, so the whole time travel thing in Volume 2 was completely unrelated to the events of the white violin incident. As I mentioned, going back to the 1960s was the only part of the Volume 2 story arc that the show decided to incorporate into Season 2, and amusingly, they decided to go with, amongst several other storylines, them failing to prevent the assassination of President Kennedy. I say amusing because in the comic, through a combination of surreal circumstances and blackmail, they were forced to be active participants participants in his murder. Allison was eventually the one to actually kill him, using her powers to simulate a bullet to the head after all the many potential shooters were eliminated. It's hard to be 100% sure of this because of the art style, but the entire cast appears to be white in the comic, despite establishing that the mystery children were born all over the world and having names like Diego. The show corrects for this slight plot hole by introducing some racial diversity. An interesting omission was everybody's superhero costumes and names. All of the Umbrella Academy graduates had their own superhero identity, except for 5 who vanished before he could choose one. Luther was Space Boy, a slightly ironic name considering space is where all the worst stuff happened to him. Diego was known as the Kraken, which seems to suggest that his breath-holding ability led him to become the Aquaman of the team for a while, though I'm pretty sure he only swims once in the entire comic run. Allison and Klaus were the Rumor and Seance for obvious superpower-related reasons. Before he died, Ben was called Horror, I guess because of his Cthulhu chest powers. And once she took her final form, Vanya was dubbed the White Violin by her creator. Getting into the weeds, a police detective from the comic was gender-flipped and made into a former and possibly future love interest of Diego's, though that's cut short when she's killed by Cha-Cha midway through season 1. Hazel and Cha-Cha themselves are way more developed in the show, especially once Hazel falls for a donut store worker and decides to run away with her. In the comic, they're both men. I think. It's a little hard to tell because they never take their big cartoonish masks off. They're fairly two-dimensional, insane, sadistic killers. The one part of the original plot they stick to is them kidnapping Klaus, but they both die immediately afterwards as Klaus possesses Cha-Cha to kill Hazel and then themselves. However, apparently the Academy's time travel shenanigans in Volume 2 altered the present timeline enough to officially retcon this and allow these two weirdos to go on living and even get their own spin-off short. Final thoughts. So, I think it's pretty apparent that the showrunners saw the concept of a deeply fallible superhero family with dysfunctional hang-ups and personality flaws mainly due to generational trauma and said, okay, but wouldn't it be way more relatable if this was set in a more realistic world and they were more realistic people? And I think the answer is yes. Yes, it is. Because they seem more human in the show, their struggles seem more real, and it's way more engaging as a result. While that's definitely a point in the show's favor, they are so different in so many other ways, it's really not possible to say if it improved on the comic. They took the basic outline of the book and made their own thing with it, and the end result is just too far away from the original to claim it's better or worse. A visually accurate adaptation of the Umbrella Academy was probably never feasible in live action, but you could make the argument that they showed they could be reasonably accurate to the story in season 1, so why not later seasons? Well, I don't have access to Blackman's mind, but I can hazard some guesses. For one thing, they had done so much more character development in season 1, it would have been pretty hard to justify the characters making the same choices that they did in the second volume of the comic, and subjective thought, but I personally found volume 2 significantly more convoluted and meandering story-wise, so it would have been a lot harder to recreate. Because the start of season 3 was something of a reset, that might have been an opportunity to get back on a more comic book accurate path, but why bother when their own writing was clearly appealing to a much wider audience than the comparatively niche comic books? Then old Icarus flew too close to the sun, but that's not super relevant to this review, I'm just upset about it. So yeah, the Umbrella Academy was for the most part damn good television, but it hella fails my personal adaptation test, i.e. would I recommend it to a fan of the comic and vice versa. Even the relatively much more story accurate first season is such a different entity. Having enjoyed the comic probably wouldn't have any bearing on if you'd enjoy the show, and if you're a fan of the show, that's really not an indicator that there's any pressing need to try the comic. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. An extra special thank you to my patrons for making what I do possible, and an extra special thank you to the big 3, April Mack, Shelby Holtz, and beloved Selphine. If you'd like to hear about other comic book adaptations I've covered, do avail yourselves of these links to the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and Red, and I do hope you'll join me in the next video.